Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sue Thompson, and I'm here this afternoon with Phil Wildman, and we're going to give you an overview of CAT4, the fourth edition of the Cognitive Abilities Test. And our understanding is that all of those attending this afternoon are currently using the third edition, CAT3, and we'll be looking to move over to the fourth edition in the near future. So just very quickly, just to give you a little bit of background, as you probably know, the Cognitive Abilities Test has been available through GL assessment for many years now, and we're on our fourth edition, which was published in 2012. We are now looking to move all of our customers from the third edition to the fourth edition, and it might be helpful for you to have a little bit of background on the changes that we made when we decided to create the fourth edition 2 years ago. There were several things we wanted to do in the fourth edition. It's always important when you're dealing with standardised assessments that the data is kept up to date. So we reckon that every 8 to 10 years we need to produce a new standardisation. Even if we do nothing to the test content, it's important that the data reflects students that are in schools now. But at the same time, we wanted to change the structure of the Cognitive Abilities Test, and we wanted to include a separate spatial ability test. We wanted, if we could, to reduce the overall testing time, and we have actually achieved that. And very importantly, we wanted to work with customers to produce new style reports, and we have done that, and those have been very successful. Feedback from users tells us that these reports are much more accessible than the reports that come with CAT3. So we have a digital and a paper edition, as you know, exactly the same as CAT3. For those of you who are using CAT3 in the paper format, it is possible to move to CAT4 digital quite seamlessly. And one of the biggest benefits from using the digital test is that all of the reports are immediately available. As soon as you have finished your test session, everything is scored automatically, and you can run your report straight away, so there's absolutely no delay between ending the testing and having access to the reports. So I touched briefly on the spatial ability test in CAT4. There were several things we wanted to do. We wanted to review the verbal content of the test. It's very important when you're dealing with tests that include language, that the language is still relevant to students today. So that was a priority. We also wanted to remove as much as possible the effects of prior learning, because although CAT tests developed abilities, we like to minimise as much as we can the effects of educational experiences that have gone before. So, for example, we removed the sentence completion from the verbal test, and we removed the equation building from the quantitative test. And we created a separate battery for spatial ability, and this means that our profiling of each student can be much more accurate. So we report on 4 aspects of ability, and we feel that together those are the main abilities that underpin academic achievement. We make a contrast, as we'll see when we move on to the reports, between the verbal and the spatial, and that has allowed us to create a student profile that is slightly different to the one that you'll be using in CAT3. It has crossover, there are similarities, but it is slightly different. And by including a separate spatial test, we were able to do that. As you will know, CAT3 has a non-verbal battery, which includes 2 short tests of non-verbal ability and 1 of spatial ability, and we felt that that was really merging two very distinct abilities. So by creating the separate spatial battery, we were able to differentiate very clearly between non-verbal reasoning and spatial ability. Let me just move on to the next slide. So just to very quickly run over the benefits of the fourth edition. Some of those are exactly the same as CAT3, but we feel the model that we have created is much more relevant for today. So as with CAT3, you're looking at developed abilities and academic potential. You're looking at strengths, weaknesses, and in CAT4, learning preferences, and we'll see that in a moment when we look at the student profile. We've now got the 4 distinct abilities, and we have split nonverbal from spatial reasoning. CAT4 is an even more useful baseline on transition to secondary, and it includes indicators for a range of examinations. The model is exactly the same through primary and secondary. So you're testing the same thing in the same way, but at an increasing level of difficulty. One of the biggest benefits of CAT4 is the new suite of reports, and that includes a report to parents and a report to the student. And those 2 reports, along with the report for the teacher on the individual student, includes some narrative, which again, customers said, we want to have some words to go with the numbers so that we can interpret the scores from CAT4. We've also created a combination report, and this allows schools to report on CAT4 with one or other of a progress test in English, progress test in maths, or the new group reading test. So it allows you to look at ability with English and maths, or ability with reading and maths, and that takes the verbal score from CAT4 and compares it either with English or reading, and the quantitative score with maths. So that's another very nice report which is free of charge, and if you use CAT4 plus 1 or 2 of those other assessments, you can run that report. So as I said, we have got a range of new reports that I think you will find look very different from the CAT3 reports. And I'm going to hand over now to Phil, who is just going to say something to introduce the reports, and then he will be actually showing you some of the pages from the CAT4 reports. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in and we will answer them as we go along. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Sue. My name's Phil Wildman, and welcome to everybody to this webinar. Yeah, Sue says I hope to have a look at some of the new reports and actually show you examples of how they actually look. But just before that, just some kind of rationale, as it were, for those new reports. In CAT3, you'll be used to seeing the reports sort of en masse in a very quite flat way. They're presented all at the same time, and then they're not really differentiated for specific audiences. And with CAT4, that's what we've tried to do, so that people aren't bombarded with data that really is of less use to them than it perhaps would be others within the school. Within the paper and the digital version that is scored for CAT4, you automatically get the group report for teachers. Now, although that sounds like it's a single thing, I like to think of it more as a collection of reports that are specifically around best use for teachers reporting on individual scores, but in a group way. The reports themselves have much more narrative and much more clearly explained, and we hope that through making them easier to understand, that will lead to greater use of that data, and that will lead to better progress for the pupils themselves, so that we're actually taking that data and getting it into the classroom. So let's have a look at, see if I can go to the next page, which is being very resistant. There we are. Yeah, technology, a wonderful thing. So just going through a few of the reports, I mentioned that the group report for teachers is the one that's in the standard package, as it were, but we have developed, as Sue said, a number of reports that run alongside that make the data fit a particular audience and, again, best use. I should start with one that's perhaps least exciting, and that's the CAT4 Excel report, which produces the data, but not in a glossy PDF format, but in Excel format, but that does mean that you can take that data and run with it yourself and import it into school management systems or manipulate it further for yourself. The individual report for teachers is an individual student report for teachers, and that's I feel, particularly useful report. For me, a lot of this importance of using the CAT is about getting the data used alongside the individual pupil. Another new thing that has never appeared in CAT3, and that is we're also putting forward a suggested optional report for students and a report for parents. And we will have a quick look at those in a moment so you can see what they actually consist of. And then finally, for senior leaders, we've put together two reports. One is a summary report that has all the usual kind of demographics that are particularly useful for school leaders in following focus groups, special interest groups, and making sure that overall progress is tracked. The summary presentation is actually a PowerPoint that contains that information, and it's really useful for sharing that data, perhaps with governors, perhaps with other interested parties like parents' evenings, or even in presentations to the staff to make sure that everybody's aware of what the CAT is, why we're doing it, and what kind of data is coming out of it. Okay, so just in a little bit more detail, the group report for teachers. So this incorporates the vast majority of the information that was in the CAT3 reports, but now in a much more clear way and with specific aims. So here we show that the student scores, standardized age scores, and group rank. And we've tried to keep other statistical jargon out of it because our research showed that these scores were the ones that were really being used by teachers, and others were really sometimes getting in the way. Perhaps more useful working with individuals, and as you'll see later, that's actually where these scores reappear in those individual reports. There'll still be the same analysis of group against national average. Standardized scores allow us to look not only at a simple score, but for that simple score always to be able to see where that level of performance or ability is in a UK distribution. The descriptors of each profile. Now the profile type, as Sue said, the research out of the USA particularly is showing the importance of spatial reasoning. And for that reason, we've taken on an idea of using verbal as an example of an extreme verbal bias or profile, if you like, and at the opposite end of that continuum, spatial to represent the most non-verbal, if you like, or perhaps non-verbal only confuses it, the most opposite to a pure verbal profile. So what we do is we place students along that continuum between a bias towards learning by verbal means and those with a more spatial ability. We certainly have retained all the indicators that many schools find very useful in in the process of setting targets for their students. And that's all within the group report. Okay, probably not so visible if it's anything like the one I've got in front of me, but that rather colourful square represents a scattergraph of how we're initially showing the individual students' bias towards that verbal or spatial. The more orange or red the children are in this plot, the more they are verbally biased, and the more they tend towards the green, blue and purple, the more spatially. And you can see the little dots. You may not be able to make them out very clearly, but there's little red dots and blue dots, and the blues are boys and the reds are girls. The diagonal black dashed line represents where there is no difference between the verbal and the spatial scores. So within that white area, there would be little statistically meaningful bias either way. It also shows us another thing at the same time, and that is the more they are towards the top right-hand corner, the more overall that higher their ability scores are, so they're more likely to be your high flyers perhaps. And the more they are towards the left-hand corner, those that might need more support, especially with more cognitively difficult exercises. Okay. Moving on then to that individual report for teachers. Here this is a single report on a single student. And here we actually take the basic information of, oh, they might be moderately spatially biased or perhaps mildly verbally biased, but we actually take that further from our work working with partner schools and other experts in the educational field. We've actually developed a kind of a database of comments, narrative, that actually relate to specific absolute CAT scores and biases towards verbal or spatial. So for each individual, we can actually produce up to about a page of A4 of handy hints and tips about how a particular bias might manifest itself in the classroom and how you might best work with those particular biases. Sometimes it's unavoidable that we have to go in a certain way in terms of delivery, but it's also about raising awareness that within any group there'll be very, very different pupils' ability to take on information in any particular one way. And it's very important, even if we can't always do something immediately about that, to at least recognise that others will have difficulties where others don't. Sample reports, that website you can see at the bottom of the screen, is a good place to look at specific examples, but we will look at some. Why use CAT? I think before I do, let's have a look at the specifics, as it were. And unless my colleague, because I'm a complete technophobe, on actually starting that sharing of my screen so you can have a look at the particular reports. So if all's well, you should start to be seeing a screen now that shows an individual report for teachers. So if you think back, this is the one that's specifically about one pupil or student. And on the screen, you will see that we report in those 4 batteries: verbal, quantitative, non-verbal, and spatial. And there you can see the national percentile ranks showing that position within UK distribution. And you can also see that displayed pictorially. Further down the screen, there's that scattergraph again, but less cluttered this time because it's just for an individual. So for this particular individual, you can see there that on the cusp pretty much between a mild and a moderate spatial bias. But beyond that, which I think is fantastic, is where we take that data, and for this individual, as you heard me mention, there is some on what it might mean to be moderately spatially biased, but also how we can actually work with that child to make sure that they are accessing the best they can from the material and are able to process and assimilate new information. Okay. I'm going to go just a bit further down the list, as it were. Now, indicators are still retained, so I'm going to try and see if I can turn that to the right. I can't remember which one. It's shift. Okay, I'm going to have to use the other way, which is that one. There we are. Okay, so these are indicators. It's Key Stage 3, but I just wanted to illustrate that within the individual report for students, there is a lot of detail, and it's not simply a single possible national curriculum level or GCSE grade, and a word about GCSE grades to follow. But what is important, you'll see a major difference between CAT3 and CAT4, is that within CAT3 we only gave one indicator. We're now giving two. So what was on CAT3 as just the one indicator, we're now calling most likely. Now the most likely is the one based around the performance of a child on the 50th percentile of the distribution. But we're also including a challenging indicator, which is based around the performance linked to a child who is in the top 25% of students, the 75th percentile. So we both have a likely and a more challenging. Now, with national curriculums going, perhaps the better example would be to show that for GCSE, but it's exactly the same principle. Most likely and a challenging. And further, we're actually splitting that up to show this probability table, which actually allows great conversations between teachers and individuals on, well, it's all very well saying, oh, you are most likely to get, say, I don't know, a B in French or whatever, but to explore why some students didn't get a B in French, or sometimes why they got an A star. How we can identify what those other factors are that are to do with the individual and work on them alongside, to say, what is it we can work together to make sure that although you are indicated as most likely to get a B, what can we do to work together to get you that A star? Okay, I'm going to go through these reports fairly swiftly, just to highlight that GCSE one, same principles, and this is where I'll just make one little point, and that is regarding grades. You'll be aware that these are now changing to numbers, and we will, it's just on the group report, but we will actually be mapping these. There'll be a separate column alongside the indicated grades to show indicated levels or numbers at GCSEs. So we are starting that process with National Curriculum Key Stage 3 levels. We're waiting, and Key Stage 2, we're waiting a little bit more time to see how the dust settles, as it were, to work out how these new systems will actually work and look like, and then we'll be able to do appropriate mapping. Okay. And then A level. I'm going to go further down the list, and again I'm going to try and make that turn the other way. I have to do it 3 times this time. But worth showing, I think, because this is how we're suggesting perhaps an individual report for students could look. This is, again, showing scores in the 4 batteries, but here none of the jargon of standardised scores. I should say, however, that due to feedback and working with other groups, we've actually decided to remove those large headers that say below average, average and above average, and include that detail less, as it were, in your face down the page, much further down the page. It's still there, but we wondered if perhaps as a highlight there, it perhaps was giving the wrong message. The summary that follows is actually an adaptation of that larger narrative that you saw in the individual report for students, but with made particular reference to the individual student in this case. The report for parents is very similar in that the standardized age scores and other standardization jargon is kept out, but there the summary would be tailored for what kind of things the parent could do to work with that individual student to help them. Okay. I'm not going to show you the indicators all over again, but they do occur within those parental and student reports. And just to show you that the parent one is quite similar, my computer's catching up. You can see that there is an explanation of what the CAT is as well, because often we found that although the data from CAT is very, very useful within schools, perhaps schools haven't always been terribly keen to explain to other stakeholders what they've been doing with the CAT. So sometimes parents and even the students will be unaware of the purposes. And there's the report again, but as I say, the summary now is all about how you might support your son or daughter. Just to finish those off, as it were, I just want to show you some of the format for the reports for senior leaders. This is where some of this data you would have been getting within CAT4, but this is where it's all collected together now, and we're able to do these slices through the whole cohort. This is a group analysis, so this is everybody, but within the 4 different batteries, the red mountain shape in the background is the UK distribution. So in this school, for example, you can see that it's overpopulated, if you like, with average type scores, especially within verbal and quantitative, but right at the top. Anyway, you can interpret that. It's the difference between the bars and the mountain shape. But that cutting and slicing, I'm going to have to rotate it again. There we are. That's a slice through the data for gender. So pink, not very PC, I'm afraid, pink for girls and blue for boys. But you can really see how we can take that data not only for gender, but we could do that for their ethnicity, various groups in ethnicity. We could do it for English as an additional language. We could do it for free school meals. There are customizable fields as well, so if you were able to actually identify the disadvantaged students or any other group of students you specifically wanted to look at, we could slice this same data for those groups. And that's another one, that's special educational needs. But if I just keep it this way around, so it's the right rotation for the next set of graphs. So this is English as an additional language. And you can imagine that we can actually show that breakdown for the whole group. I haven't actually got an example of the PowerPoint, but it contains that data, but in PowerPoint format. Once again, that's the overview of particular biases, if you like, cognitive strengths and weaknesses. That report, to some extent, did exist in some ways in CAT4, but it was a kind of quadrant diagram, and it was non-verbal against verbal. Not that that was wrong, but with actually having this spatial data, we've been able to make a clearer comparison between verbal thinkers and spatial thinkers.
Can I just add something there?
Yes, of course.
The non-verbal score will be very useful to give you an idea of general ability, because it does combine verbal and visual skills. The sorts of questions that we include in our non-verbal reasoning test require a student to combine both the verbal with the visual, and if they have a preference towards verbal, they will use their verbal reasoning skills to think through the task, and if they're more visual, they will solve it more visually. The difference with spatial ability is that you do not have you do not have that verbal ability to rely on. It's an almost totally visual task. So certainly if you are working with children with EAL, the non-verbal reasoning score is a very, very useful score to use with them, because they have used their own inner voice, their own first language, if that's what they choose to do, to reason through those tasks. So I just wanted to add that there.
Yeah, and while we're there, I think that I'd say all those batteries are important. As Sue's mentioned earlier, in the combination reports, we actually use that quantitative score to flag up alongside the progress test maths. So it's that all of that information is very useful. And I think it is worth remembering that, because we have made this part of it very clear and colourful, but that other data is definitely still there and for you to use. So not the PowerPoint presentation, but just to finish off really, this is something that I wasn't able to show you actually when we had the group report. We didn't have a visual for that, but if I have to do the 3 times, it would be facing the wrong way, wouldn't it? This actually appears within the group report for teachers, and it gives you for each of the bands, if you like, in that first scattergraph that have all the students on it, running from extreme verbal bias all the way to extreme spatial bias, the number of students in your group compared to a national sample, but it will actually list the individual students that fall within each of those bands. So as a top level information on this thinking bias, very, very useful. But the individual report for me is the one, because it takes it down to looking at, guess what, individuals and how they are best helped. Just to finish the seniors report, and in fact the reports altogether, I think, is this generalized information in terms of the kind of information that in the past we've had to supply about national curriculum levels, but oops, that's a bit quick, but also GCSE grades and distributions. They are, I should stress, about that 50th percentile, that about most likely, and that of course I would see these as a kind of national benchmark by which you could look at the school's performance and see where it differed and look to explain those differences. And that's what it's for. It's not trying to say, oh, I'm doing better than that, let me pull back. Oh, I'm a lot worse than this, what am I doing wrong? It's about having a yardstick that is a national yardstick to be able to make meaningful questioning statements about what's going on within the school. And so now to my techno friend. And nope, and we're on this last slide, which is just a kind of summary slide, and I'm going to literally run through it in a minute, just to recap then. So CAT4 is about developed abilities and likely potential, but they have to be mitigated with what you know it's about the student. It's very much about working in partnership, as it were. Cognitive strengths and weaknesses, we've had a little look at that, and yes, spatial and verbal, very, very important because they're opposites to each other, but within that we've also got the other 2 batteries. Gifted and talented, we didn't really have time to explore that fully, but within that distribution, that UK distribution, we're able to say, I don't want to draw a particular line at a particular score, but it's easy to see from those percentile ranks, those students that are in the top 10% of ability, for instance. They would certainly be likely to be very talented students. And we can also look at the other end to look at those that, as we said before, would perhaps be challenged by some of the cognitive complexity of the work in school and would need support. And also, in generalized, helping in the process of target setting, not as a blanket level to be achieved, but working with individuals to explore how the very best could be brought out of each of them. I think I'm handing back to you now, Sue.
Yes. just to explain what's going to happen, CAT3, the digital edition of CAT3 will no longer be available after August this year. It won't be supported. So if you are going into September and you want to test digitally using CAT, you will need to move over to CAT4. And the same applies to the paper edition, but 12 months on. So again, from September in 2016, if you want to use paper, you will have to use CAT4. We have a renewals team who are very happy to help you and discuss various options and exactly what you need to do. The number is on the screen now. You press option 1 and then option 2, or if you'd rather, you can